As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
So we know that psychological richness is correlated with complexity, novelty, and challenge. It's often unexpected, and too much planning is going to give us all these expectations that'll just literally block out our experiences of the interesting. But we also can learn to be more comfortable challenging ourselves. We can find more novelty in life. But I think it's also really important to notice that we can find novelty in life wherever we are just by starting to noticing things. So it's not that we have to make these dramatic changes to experience the interesting. It's more that we have to shift our minds so that we find the interesting.
That was Lorraine Besser on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Hello, everyone. This is Michael, and I'm sitting here with Debbie to discuss my latest interview with Lorraine Besser on The Art of the Interesting, which I found such an eye-opening book. I totally loved it. Debbie, what were your thoughts on the interview?
Well, first of all, Michael, a lot of your episodes end up getting me excited about things. And I think that's really reflected in this interview as well. I had never really thought quite so explicitly about how curiosity and having interesting experiences is tied to our well-being. And so it was really kind of cool. And you and Lorraine talk about some examples of why this is important and how to hone into it. I actually think I was tapping into this a little bit without even realizing it. And I'll give you an example of this. So I recently, I have that book out, Act for Burnout, and I recently did an author event at a local bookstore. And in the hours leading up to it, it was kind of the morning before the event was going to occur that evening, I was like, why am I doing this? I'm nervous. This is kind of embarrassing to be in the center of attention. And I was thinking to myself, why am I doing this? I had a little bit of sense of like, is this going to be worth it? A tiny tinge of dread and nerves. And I said to myself, you know what? This is going to be an interesting experience that I'm probably not going to do very many times in my life. And there was something about framing it as an interesting experience that really helped me. I kind of reframed it as something like, this is going to be kind of cool. And it may not be fun, but it is going to be a challenge and an interesting experience. And it made it a lot more like, okay, this is worth doing. And in the end, it was worth doing.
Interesting, pun intended.
Yeah. So anyway, but your episode reminded me of why that can sometimes be just a really important thing to make sure that we're incorporating in our life in some way. It's just having these interesting experiences, even if sometimes they're a bit challenging or outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah, and this is something that I really liked about the book as well. She writes about this in the last chapters or so about the book and how we can bring this mindset of finding the interesting into situations that are challenging, that are real obstacles, that are just bad, that are just really difficult, very difficult situations in life. And she makes a clear point that this is not about making this feel easier or making us feel happy instead, but just like you said, to find that interesting in the situation.
So I want to recommend a practice that can help people do exactly that, to find the interesting in various situations. I have a little notebook I carry with me, and I do that because I have ideas or just something that occurs to me. And if I don't capture it, it'll be gone. My memory, that's not what it used to be. My brain is overloaded. And so I just jot things down. And what I've started doing is also writing down little tidbits, just things I notice. So maybe it's a conversation with one of my kids or something I read somewhere, like a quote or just something that I'm like, oh, I want to learn more about this. And I just take a note. I just jot down a little bullet point note. And sometimes I go back later and I look at it and maybe I write about it, or I, jump online and learn something about it, or just think about it more. And I've actually sometimes used that in my writing, or it's just a way for me to kind of shuffle back through and look at some of the different things that came up. And it's almost like it sparks that sense of curiosity because I'm paying attention to the world in a way that just things I wouldn't normally even notice, or I'm just kind of tuning into them a little bit more, enough to jot down a note.
Yeah, I should do that more too. I just saw that in my bookshelf the other day. I have this amazing notebook. It's actually fluffy. It has like the fur, like it's like unicorn fluffy, kind of with the face of a unicorn. It's the most amazing notebook ever. And I used to do just that, like take it with me and jot down thoughts. And now that we talk about this, the last one is probably 2 years ago. So I need to grab that fluffy notebook again and get started on that.
And a little quick warning for those of you who are listening with young children present, that in the beginning of the episode, Michael and Lorraine talk about Santa Claus. And so just be aware of who's listening.
Thank you for that disclaimer, Debbie. So I hope you all enjoy my interview with Lorraine Besser. Lorraine Besser is a professor of philosophy at Middlebury College who specializes in the philosophy and psychology of the good life and teaches popular courses for undergraduates on happiness, well-being, and ethics. An internationally recognized scholar, she was a founding investigator on the research team studying psychological richness. Lorraine is the author of 2 academic books and dozens of professional journal articles on moral psychology. Today, I have the pleasure of discussing her new book, The Art of the Interesting, What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It. Hello, Lorraine. It's so good to have you on the show.
Thank you. It is really nice to be here.
So I want to start this interview with a quote from your book that I kind of highlighted, and I thought to myself, this is setting the expectations really high. Here's the quote. What we've been sold as the formula for good lives doesn't pan out. Maybe you've asked yourself, isn't there more? And come up empty. Ask again. I've got the answer. So, Lorraine, I'm super happy to have someone here who has the answer to this formula for a good life. So I'm thinking we can start by pulling out the carpet from everyone's feet by talking about how they have misconceptions about living the good life. And then we can light the fireworks and bring in the big band and have you introduce us to The Art of the Interesting, which is also the title of your fantastic book.
Great. Thank you. Yes. So in our common discussions about the good life, we often talk in terms of 2 broad categories, happiness and meaning. And by meaning, I mean a lot of concepts, including purpose, achievement, virtue. And for many years, this has just dominated our discussions. And I think this is a mistake. It's a mistake because it overlooks a really important part of life. When we think about our life as in full, there's a lot of experiences that we have that really just don't fit into those categories. And I feel like when we are told that the good life consists in one of these things, that we feel like we can't prioritize other experiences, and we feel like we have to really shoot. If we're going for the good life, we feel like we really have to shoot high on one of these areas or both. The problem with that strategy is that if you look closely at what these concepts are tracking, happiness and meaning, they're tracking states that are really difficult to sustain and to achieve. And so I think there are limits built into our experiences of happiness, and there are challenges, real big challenges towards living a meaningful life. And if we place our eggs in either of those baskets, we're just bound to fall short on those categories, and we're squeezing out a whole nother part of life.
I remember learning about the elusiveness of happiness and fulfillment. And it felt a bit like learning that Santa doesn't exist. And when I learned that, that was a really tough year in college for me. And then followed that up by learning that what this happiness and this fulfillment is also not the real deal. Can we dig into the details a little bit more? Because you make really good points of why those two don't give us the results that we hope for, that we're promised. So let's start with talking about happiness and pleasure and air quotes, what's wrong with the dedicated pursuit of it.
Yeah. Happiness is great. And the fact that there are limits to it doesn't take away its importance. And it just means that we are better off learning about those limits and respecting them as we try to achieve a good life. So happiness is essentially a pleasurable state. And the thing about pleasure is that we adapt to it very quickly. So there are all sorts of kinds of research that we have about how quickly these feelings of pleasure fade. And it makes sense from a scientific level, right? So pleasure is meant to be our reward. It's a reward system. And if pleasure were sustained, then we'd never have any motive to go back, right? We would just be happy and forever. And it just doesn't work like that. So pleasure fades, we adapt, and our minds, our bodies can't take high levels of pleasure. It's just not meant to operate at these sustained levels. So the real problem with happiness is that there are real limits to it. And we can experience moments of pleasure. And I think there are things that we can do to expand those feelings and to make them last longer. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a cap. And I love your Santa Claus analogy. A little bit I'm delivering kind of bad news about happiness, but I think it tracks our experience. I think that we all have the experience of feeling really happy, and then in the blink of an eye, it's gone. And we're like, what? So I think that it's really important to recognize the limits so that you don't feel bad about yourself. We don't want to set ourselves up high with all of these expectations and then feel bad about ourselves when all of a sudden happiness goes away.
Yeah. This is one evolutionary thing that you mention in that chapter where you say, look, if you eat and then you're happy, you feel good. I'm paraphrasing, you might have used a different example, but you eat something, you feel good. This can't last forever because then you would never, ever eat again. If you feel good because you've just made a human connection with someone else, this can't last forever because you would never, ever talk to someone else. So it's evolutionarily built to just be this little blip and then fade out and have you pursue the next one. It's a bonus reward at the end of doing something meaningful, hopefully. And this reminds me of clients that will, as their goal for their work with me, say, look, I just want to be happy the entire time. That's my goal. I'm not asking for too much. I just want to be happy. And well, first, using just in that sentence is quite a stretch because that's asking for a lot. And I just want to be happy is also something that is somewhat similar to saying, I just want to be a Smurf. I just want to be small and live in a village made of mushrooms. What's wrong with that? Well, it's not possible. It's a good ambition, but it's just not possible.
Yeah. And throughout the book, I talk about the good life in terms of our best possible lives. And I think that's really important to think about. We want to set our sights on things that are actually obtainable, right? Which doesn't mean it's going to be easy or natural or things like that, but it should be within our capacities. And as you say, it's not within our capacity to be happy all the time. There's many messages that we get from society that puts it out there that happiness is what we're after and that we can be happy in this long-term sustained sense. And I don't think it helps us.
Hey, Michael here. As you might have already heard, I'm currently working on a book on confidence building, having better conversations, and making friends. Would you like to work with me to make this happen? I don't know about you, but I like self-development books that aren't just about the theory and the exercises. I like books that are full of real stories and insights from people who have worked through the concepts and have gotten the results they wanted. And that's how I envision my book too. So I'm looking for a handful of coaching clients to work with me over the next couple of weeks. If you struggle with confidence or your social skills, we can work together for 8 weeks in one-on-one coaching sessions that are tailored towards your specific goals. And your story will, anonymously, of course, be featured in my book and help and inspire others. I'm only going to work on this with 10 people, and as a thank you, offer 50% off my coaching package. If you think this is for you, then head over to herald.coach/book and apply. That's all. Back to the show. What about fulfillment then? What about finding purpose and meaning in life? And now we're fulfilled and we're basically in rock star mode and everything is downhill from here on out. What's wrong with my assessment of that one?
Yeah, I love your assessment. It's the dream, right? It is the dream that we will find something to pursue, that when we get it, it'll deliver us fulfillment. It'll pay off for us somehow. And I think there are two challenges with that. First of all, fulfillment is elusive. Even when we pursue something and find something that's great, and that's really hard, let's face it. It's really hard to pick a purpose, pick a cause, pick something that will reliably deliver a sense of fulfillment. I worry a lot about effective forecasting, the difficulties that we have in predicting the impact of certain states upon our emotional state. And I think that very often when we search for fulfillment and we find ourselves at the end of the day, we've succeeded, we've written our book, we have accomplished our work goals, we have found some kind of purpose. Very often it leaves us short. It leaves us flat. I know I've had this experience. And if you look around, I think many people have had this experience of finally getting it, what it is that you're after, and then just feeling flat. And that I think is really common. It's well documented. I don't think enough people are aware of this. I think it'll really help to take this into consideration. So there are things that we can do to experience, more fulfillment. I feel I'm always an advocate for giving these experiences the space to flourish, right? Give pleasure the space to shine, give fulfillment the chance, right? Take a deliberate pause and when you're done with a project and reflect. I think you'll find some kind of fulfillment there, but it's not very long lasting. And in some sense, I think it's even shorter than pleasure. And I really don't know why. There's not a big scientific reason. With pleasure, we've deduced it from our research on our own physiology. But with fulfillment, it's just really unclear why it doesn't really last. But it doesn't. And we're bad at predicting. We might get there, but it doesn't last. And then there's all sorts of problems that happen on the road to getting there. So we often talk as if we have one unique purpose that's out there. And it's a myth. I think it happens for some. It happens for some, certainly, that they find their one true calling. But I think for a lot of us, it's a myth. And we can spend a lot of time searching for our purpose and feeling bad about ourselves for not getting there. So to find fulfillment in your activities, you've got to be able to somehow interact with the world in a way that delivers fulfillment. So fulfillment is really not entirely up to us. We have to accomplish something. We have to accomplish something meaningful, right? Something that will deliver some kind of reward. And very often, whether or not our accomplishments are worthy of feeling fulfilled depends on other people's affirmation or somehow making a contribution to the world. And that puts a lot of this stuff out of our hands. And so that's a big problem.
This idea of achievement, that we find this purpose in our life, that's this overspanning arch for, the 60, 70, 80 years of our life. But then it kind of depends on other people, like registering what we've done and what we've achieved. It's very paradoxical. And when you talked about like people finding their purpose and what or trying to find their purpose and what a problem that might be, I'm reminded of many workshops that I did for rooms full of like 20-year-olds. And the biggest problem in the room was like hands went up. It's like, Michael, how do I find my purpose? Like, you're freaking 21 years old. Like, enjoy life. Like, you don't need to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life. And also, like you said, purpose can change. I remember very vividly when I was in my early 30s, I was working in the film industry, doing my best to entertain people. And I had checked off like every goal that I had ever set for myself. And I remember one day I was drinking my coffee in a lunch break, and I was like, why am I not fulfilled? Like there's every check mark, and still every day I have to decide from the word go. When my alarm clock goes off, I have to now decide, okay, today is going to be a good day. And then things changed and I found a new purpose.
I like that attitude, right? It is so much on the day-to-day level that we can really make gains. We can, even just by committing ourselves to making that day good. When we're chasing fulfillment, right, all our eggs are somehow further down the line, and we're waiting for something to happen. And unfortunately, very often, even when something happens, as you said, you had your list, and we all have lists of our accomplishments and our projects. Yet when we look at our lists, it does feel very often disappointing, or we're let down somehow. There's, an early study was on the effects of getting tenure, right, which something is in my field it's huge. It's big. We work so hard towards getting tenure. And yet studies have shown, and I've experienced, this thing called post-tenure depression, right? Where all of a sudden you've gotten everything you've wanted, and it's like, now what? What do I go for next? What could do it? So that's not uncommon. And I think it speaks to, I think with our aspirations for purpose and fulfillment, it really just speaks to these combination of factors, many of which, again, are out of our control, depend on other people, depend on the world, and then depend on us reacting to those inputs in a certain way. So it really evades us a lot.
As a historical side note, so to speak, is there any like point in human history when individual purpose was started to be discussed? Like, did someone find like a 3,000-year-old clay tablet that said like 5 questions to ask yourself if you want to find your purpose? When did this show up in our society?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So most of our discussions about the good life go back to Aristotle, who's an ancient Greek philosopher and first started carving out these areas of the good life. And his approach towards thinking about purpose, it was actually different than ours. So he thought that as human beings, as basic rational animals, that we all share fundamentally the same true purpose, which is to operate at the highest levels of our rational ability. So for a long time, it was more, generic, right? You have this purpose just as a human being. Where we start to carve out, like, how can I find my purpose? Or how can I, 5 things to find my purpose. I think the source of where we can find purpose may go back to the development of positive psychology, right? To where at a certain time in the late 90s, we really started taking seriously discussions of the good life because there was psychological research all of a sudden on the good life and real solid tips that we could use to start to obtain it. And that certainly stimulated broader general conversations of happiness and the good life outside of academics. And so I'm not, I don't know how to pin down that source, but I'm pointing to that area.
Well, if you're an archaeologist listening and you found that clay tablet, I'd love to see a photo of it. This is where it started. So, talking about Aristotle, by the way, so you are a philosopher. And what we're talking about today, The Art of the Interesting, is a project that and you need to correct me here because I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but this was a project that you worked together with a psychologist, Shigehiro Oishi.
Dr. Shigehiro Oishi.
Okay, you're much better at that than I am. And he was the psychologist and brought you in as the philosopher to look at the two sides. So fundamental question number one, what is the difference between, this is going to sound so superficial, what's the difference between a philosopher and a psychologist? And I'm asking because I know what a psychologist does, but when I hear philosopher, I think jumps out of bathtubs a lot, yells eureka, and hopefully grabs a towel before they run down the street. But that's as far as I go with that. So what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially since so many psychologists are now working on questions, these big questions about about happiness, about well-being. So a philosopher asks and explores questions that really can't be answered by our current scientific techniques. Back when Aristotle was the philosopher, philosophy was the main discipline. And then you can trace throughout history as different techniques for measurement, scientific engagement evolved, we have disciplines splintering off. So for a while, philosophers really did stare at the stars and think about what's going on. And then, we got microscopes and the ability to actually go further than that and have some scientific evidence for these things. So a philosopher is really interested in these questions that can't be answered through scientific means. And in the context of thinking about the good life, the really sharp difference between what philosophers are doing and what psychologists are doing is that philosophers are really trying to understand why things are valuable, what at root makes them so important to people. Philosophers study questions of value, and we're very comfortable telling people what they ought to do. And that, I think, gets to the crux of the difference between a philosopher and a psychologist. So psychologists study the human mind, and they study correlations between different activities and experiences and effects on the mind. But psychologists really aren't in the business of telling us that particular states are good and that we ought to go after them. The positive psychology movement that I just referenced, it came about in the 1990s, and that in itself was a little controversial for the field. So positive psychology is a movement towards studying the positive dimensions of human life. Prior to that, most of psychology had focused on studying pathologies, right? And for many, the goal was really, let's fix the pathologies and leave it to the individual to decide where to go beyond that and how they ought to live. And with the movement towards studying the good life and questions of happiness, positive psychology has made a really important step because at first it says these concepts can be studied and we can learn about them scientifically. But in terms of developing the concept and understanding the concept, that's really a large job for the philosopher. And when positive psychologists first started studying, they went back to Aristotle. They started talking about Aristotle's theory of happiness, which is eudaimonia. They started talking about pleasure, happiness in terms of pleasure, which we call hedonism. So philosophers over the years have examined and thought about questions about what makes for a good life, how we ought to live. And we've studied these concepts a lot.
So that would lead us to what the book is about, The Art of the Interesting, the third pillar next to pleasure, fulfillment, and the art of the interesting, Tell us about, because this is such an incredible concept that I wish I had learned this from Kermit the Frog when I was 3 years old, but it took me until now to, it's like, whoa, like this is, pun intended, really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So I describe the interesting in terms of a qualitative feature of our experiences of psychological richness. And in the psychological studies that I've conducted with, or that I've been a part of with Dr. Oshie, we've examined the notion of a psychologically rich life. And psychological richness describes the impact a set of experiences has upon the mind. And it's a particular set of experiences that involve challenge, complexity, novelty, and they have this particular impact on the mind, which shows itself in terms of a robust form of cognitive engagement. And so throughout our studies, as a psychological project, the goal was really to carve out the distinctness of psychological richness from these other more common forms of good lives. And then the project was to show that people really value it. And so in the psychological studies, we looked at daily diaries. We looked at obituaries. Obituaries are really great evidence of what people take to be important in life. And I think actually, if you start reading the good ones, right, or just start reading any of them, it's not about they were so happy all the time and they did this and this. Maybe for some individuals, it'll be about they achieved this and this. But for a lot of time, it's about the really interesting ways they've lived their lives. And so learning, first of all, that psychological richness tracks a distinct concept, a distinct form of the good life, and that it's a form of the good life that people really value, right? That gives us a really good indication that there's something that is really valuable about psychological richness. And in my work, I've shown that what makes psychological richness valuable is that it produces these interesting experiences. And interesting experiences are experiences of a robust form of cognitive engagement that stimulates new thoughts and often has this effect on our emotions. They have an emotional impact. And the combination of these new thoughts and emotional impact creates or influences your perspective, right? So when you've had a really interesting experience, your mind is engaged, often your emotions are engaged, and at the end of it, your perspective has shifted somehow, which I think is really awesome because then you have a new perspective to look out on life, and so a new perspective from which to have interesting experiences.
And at the same time, like getting that new perspective isn't the purpose of the exercise. It's like being in the moment, air quotes, like that's what it is. I'm not doing this because I get something out of it. I do it because it's intrinsically rich to be here. And you're right that it's not important what these experiences are. They're going to be different for all of us, but how they make us feel. That's the point. And maybe this was just me, but it took me a while to wrap my head around the idea of what is Lorraine like talking. I get it. I understand it. But I don't know where she wants me to go with this. And then you have this one exercise in here where you ask a couple of questions and you read through these and see where you got a little bit of an aha moment. So number one, Hawaii has the most beautiful rainbows. Number two, lemons float, but limes sink. 3, before becoming an actor, Christopher Walken was a lion tamer in the circus. Number 4, Mount Everest is taller now than it used to be. So there are a couple of more, and I'm going to assume like this is not what will lead everyone to what their interesting is. But what this list did to me was that I was reading through those 8, 9, 10 points. There was one that made me go, what? And that was the lemons float, but limes sink. Like everything else to me was like, okay, that's nice. Yeah. But this one was like, whoa, I need to read up about this. I need to buy a lemon. I need to get a lime. I need to fill my bathtub. This needs to get tested. And that for me was that's what Lorraine is talking about. That's the interesting that makes my brain light up.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I look at that list today, that lemon and lime thing absolutely stood out. But one neat thing about that list is that every time I look at it, there's something kind of different. A different item will spark me. And the goal of that list is exactly as you experienced it. We learn about the interesting through thinking about our experiences of the interesting. And we've all had interesting experiences, right? And the key is to start zeroing in on what they feel like and to let them expand. So having a list like that, or another trick I say is, just throw something in Google, right? Or look at your newsfeed, right? Look at anything and just note what sparks you. And the lemon and lime thing sparked you. That's absolutely what we're looking for, right? Some kind of reaction, some kind of way that this new idea has imprinted on your mind that just stimulates it and leads it to really take off if we let it. So I think that the interesting, we can offer definitions and descriptions of it all day. And they will be helpful, especially when we are, zeroed into the experiences that I'm trying to describe. But the best way to learn about the interesting is to really feel how it sparks you and arises within you. And by learning how it feels for you, you'll be able to start picking up on different ranges of experiences that will maybe reliably help you have those sparks. And you'll also be able to recognize the sparks of it happening and then give your mind the space to go for it, right? To let it have this journey into who knows where.
That's exactly how it felt to me, that after I had this little aha moment, like this is what I'm looking for, I could go through my day and then look for like sparks of that same feeling. And some things didn't do that at all. Like I was trying to find that spark as I was doing the laundry and I just like, nah. But then I got a voice message from a friend who asked me a question and suddenly like that spark came up. And it's like, I can explain this. I'm going to give him some resources. I'm going to give him some notes. And there's like, look at that. That's the interesting. So what do we do with it? Like, do we find more of that? Do we use it more when we find it? Do we purposefully bring it into our lives? Do we infuse it in the boring stuff that we have in life? How do we juggle? How do we utilize this?
Yeah, I think any of those strategies is a great way, but we can be a little bit more concrete about it. So to introduce more of the interesting into our lives, we really need to learn to recognize it when it's happening and give it the space to bloom. Very often when we're going through our day-to-day lives, we have many of these aha moments, but we just shut them down because we're too busy doing something else or we're otherwise not prioritizing them. But learning about the overall impact that these can have on our lives and the ways that they can enrich our lives gives us a signal to say, oh no, this is the good stuff, right? Let them go. Give your minds the space to have them. And once you become more familiar with how the interesting feels for you, because it's always an individual thing, right? What constitutes an interesting experience is always about the individual. And once you learn about what constitutes an interesting experience for you, then you're going to be better positioned to start going after it. Mm-hmm. And we can go after it in very indirect ways, right? I talk a lot in the book about how planning and directly pursuing aspects of the good life is really just not the best strategy because so many of these things, especially the interesting, arises when we least expect it. But what we can do is we can learn about the scientific correlations that we're learning about the kinds of impacts certain things have upon our minds. And so we know, for example, that psychological richness is correlated with complexity, novelty, and challenge. So we know that it's often unexpected and too much planning is going to give us all these expectations that'll just literally block out our experiences of the interesting. But we also can learn to be more comfortable challenging ourselves. We can find more novelty in life. We can find more novelty by going on a trip or traveling, but I think it's also really important to notice that we can find novelty in life wherever we are just by starting to noticing things. So it's not that we have to make these dramatic changes to experience the interesting. It's more that we have to shift our minds so that we find the interesting, because it's always there around us. There's going to be something that sparks our attention if we really just look out, and especially there's always new things happening to us. They don't have to be shockingly big or have an impact or anything like that. They just have to be new. And when our mind's confronted with something new, it'll trigger, if we are open to it and we start exploring it, it'll trigger an interesting experience.
Yeah, the two things that come to my mind that were the first that I tried out, one was eat something new. Like if you go to a restaurant, you're going to drink something you haven't tried before, you're going to eat something. And the interesting thing here was that it wasn't about this is better than what I usually eat. It was just like novelty enriched the evening. And the other thing that I did as I was going somewhere outside, I focused on what does that feel like? The temperature, the wind, the sunshine. Like, what does it feel? It was so weird. Like, I'm going the same path down the street every day, but for the first time, I like zoned in on what's the hot sun on my skin. Like, what does it actually feel like? And those were just, two of the many things I'm planning to experiment around with. And to me, as I read you describe the interesting or the psychologically rich life, my first question was, how does this overlap with mindfulness? And you talk about mindfulness in your book as well. You call it mindfulness 2.0, so we can get into the different. But I think I've figured it out. But maybe our listeners are at this point like saying, "Oh wait, Lorraine and Michael are just talking about mindfulness. What's different here?"
Yeah. Thank you. I think a large part of finding the interesting is noticing things. And that's a form of mindfulness. And I call it mindfulness 2.0 because I do think that very often in our popular discourse, the concept of mindfulness gets blown up and extended. Originally, right, at its origin, mindfulness is a form of metacognitive awareness, right? Awareness of our thought patterns. And very often in our experiences, I think it gets correlated with controlling our emotions, right? So we want to be aware of our thought patterns so that we notice the shifts towards anxiety or some destructive spin. And that's super important. Obviously, that is super important. But we can take that basic same skill of noticing and extend it outside of ourselves. When we extend it outside of ourselves, then we'll notice the novelty. We will allow our minds to engage with something, right? Whether it's the sun warming your skin or, whoever it is you're walking behind on the street, right? What we're allowing, simply by noticing these things, we're prompting the mind to engage with them. And I also wanted to distinguish mindfulness 2.0 from original mindfulness, because really one of the ways that we can expand the interesting, right? We have these sparks, but then the key is to let them go. And that's going to involve letting our emotions run with them too. So I think that in mindfulness 2.0, what we're doing really is we're looking out at the world and using those mindfulness skills to notice things. But then what we want to do is give our minds the space to take off and allow ourselves to feel things in response to them. And some of those feelings will not always be pleasant, but they're still going to be enriching. And we can learn not to shy away from them so much.
Yeah, that was also very eye-opening that these experiences aren't always pleasant. Like me going into the sun and be like, whoa, this is actually like quite hot. Not necessarily, oh, I want more of that, but let me get into the shadow. But interesting nonetheless. They might also not offer fulfillment. Like it's just like you're right. Like it's a third pillar. It's a third leg of the stool. So you're right about using those life enriching moments, the psychologically rich moments in areas of life that are a little bit more tricky, where it's not just to enrich, but it's maybe also to help a little bit as well. So if we look at the rainbow here from Michael's doing the laundry, it's boring. How can this help over to, well, there's a real challenge or there's some real struggle. How can this help there?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important features of this work. And challenge is a part of life, right? We all have challenges, some severe, some not so severe, but we still experience them with negative emotions. And this is a part of life, but in our ordinary things of the good life, it just, there's no space for those things. The framework of the interesting, first of all, gives space for complicated emotions, challenging situations within the good life. So, and I think, first of all, that is huge. That means we don't have to feel so bad every time all of a sudden we're feeling really sad about something or something bad happens to us. It doesn't sink our chances for the good life. They're still difficult, so they're going to come with unpleasant emotions. But the framework of the interesting gives us this opportunity to engage with the hard stuff in a way that doesn't involve evaluating, right? So it's not saying, oh, this is good or bad. You know it's bad, right? You don't need to do that. But it gives us a way to kind of engage with the challenging stuff that is value neutral and that'll have over time this impact of giving you this perspective on things and really just helping you through. So when something bad happens, very often we are told you should find meaning or it's not that bad. We get some form of toxic positivity. These are just really bad strategies and we've all experienced them. We know that they're just not the right things. And yet knowing that psychological richness is distinct from these concepts, it's distinct from meaning, it's distinct from happiness, that means it's available when those two things aren't, right? So we can still have psychologically rich experiences even when we're really undergoing a difficult situations. And they're not going to make those difficult situations good, but they're going to allow us to engage with it. They're going to allow us to somehow deal with it. And over time, it's going to be a productive way of dealing with it. It'll kind of shift our perspective about it. But as you said, there's this kind of immediate impact of just being able to engage with something and that enriches our minds and allows these things to take shape.
So crossing the divide between how we started this topic, me being interested about, what was it, lemons floating, but limes sinking, where the situation kind of came to me and I was recognizing the richness that it brings up and saying, okay, let's engage with this. Or the message I got that I sent to my friend, oh, this is the psychological richness Lorraine was talking about. Let me dive in here and really go with this. Now I'm in a situation where there's a challenge, where things are not nice / bad / this is, I need to sort this out. I don't want to be in the situation. Now I kind of need to find that psychological richness in there because unlike lemons and limes, they didn't present themselves. So how do I create that psychological richness, that little spark that could go in there, or how do I find it if I can't create it?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that we can start by asking why. And it doesn't have to be, why did this happen? But even starting at the tangential, right? Well, why was that person there this day? Or why was I there? Or isn't it weird that the police officers who were first on the scene at my accident didn't check my iPhone for its emergency contacts? There's all sorts of whys that we can explore and that aren't just about why did this happen to me, right? If we go past those very central question and just start exploring on the outside, we give our minds a place to be curious and to start having different thoughts about it. And that are, again, they're on the perimeter. And yet it gives us that way in where we're not just dealing with the hard aspects of the situation. But if we deal with the peripheral aspects, or we begin with the peripheral aspects, then we find a way in where we are engaging with this situation. And we all know it's always better to engage with a complicated situation than to ignore it. And so we find a way to engage it. It's not going to lead to pleasant thoughts or emotions because it's a difficult situation, but it will lead to emotions. And emotions are good to feel for us, to give them their space. And by sticking with that peripheral, we'll find our way in to go deeper. And there's a second aspect about this, which is often overlooked, I think. So we can use the framework of the interesting to engage with our challenges and to confront them. And that will, over time, give us a very enriching, rewarding experience. But in those moments where happiness isn't available, meaning's not available, we can also just find the interesting in something else.
Yeah.
And so I tell a few stories over the book about individuals suffering really horrific situations who report that they've found their way through using their minds. Right? Yeah. They've created games in their minds to get through. We might find a book. We might find we're able to read a book that's interesting to us, even though we're not in the mood for socializing or for working. So we can find the interesting not only within the challenge itself, but we can also just, in those moments where it's just too hard and we need distraction, this is a form available to us, even when things are going really bad on the outside. And it's available to us just through, again, the basics, noticing, reading, right? We can find interesting things to do, even when we are not happy and our lives seem to lack meaning.
Talking of complexity and meaning and all of the other good stuff, the last part that you discuss in your book is the importance of friends and the function that friends have. And I think the topic of like social connection is really important. The epidemic of loneliness. That's something that we've discussed, luckily, so many times on the show. So how do we make friends? What do we say?
I think we have to be honest. We say whatever is really going on with us. And when we share ourselves with our friends, we're able to share our emotions, we're able to share our experiences, and we're able to find the interesting within those spaces. So it's very often, I think, we cut ourselves off from things, or we can make friends on a superficial level. And they stay at a superficial level when we're not being honest. We're not being honest about what we're feeling. We're not being honest about what's on our mind. But I think just being honest about those things is the first essential step towards developing a friendship that'll count. And if somebody can't handle your honesty, well, then they're not going to be a deep connection for you. They might be a superficial friend, but they're not going to be a deep connection. What we're looking for in friendships is this deep connections. And yes, we've heard a lot about the importance of those to happiness, but the source of deep connections, the ways in which they add value to our lives expands across the board. So one, I think, overlooked aspect about deep connections is the way in which friends help us share emotions and feel emotions. And whenever we're sharing and feeling emotions, right, we're expanding them, we're giving ourselves a way to feel them and also to bounce off of them, right, to experience an emotion and then to be curious about that emotion and see where that leads. So friends are a source of many good things, but they're also a really good way to experience the interesting. They help us share emotions. And, I also talk about the interesting spreading between people. Yeah. And, there's nothing more interesting than being around an interesting person and having an interesting conversation. This is the really core snapshot. If you want a core snapshot of what the interesting is, think about the last interesting conversation you had or the most interesting person you know, right? When you're around interesting people, right, life becomes more interesting because these things spread between each other. And so I think that friends can really help us on many ways, but really to highlight this way of helping us feel the interesting, helping us experiencing it.
I think connecting the dots here in my own brain and thinking about my own work that I do when people have conversations, I always emphasize how important it is to talk about the things that we think about and the things that we feel, because people tend to talk about data the entire time. If I ask someone, how was your vacation? They'll tell me about the hotel, the amount of windows, what floor they were on, when the breakfast was there. It's like, no, this is like pure data. I want the you in this. What did you think about the breakfast? What did you think about being on the third floor? What did it feel like to stay? And then people do that. And what that allows me to do is I can suddenly see that world through their eyes. Because the data, I can Google that. I can just check out the hotel on the website. But now my friend tells me that she was feeling a little bit anxious about being on the third floor. It's like, oh, look at that. Where did that come from, right? And so now I'm learning more about this person because they allow themselves to share those things, which are at times like not super private or super vulnerable, but they're like a couple of degrees there. It's so much easier to tell people how much pancake they had for breakfast than to tell you how they feel about eating pancake. And so now I'm getting that perspective from it, and I'm winning because I'm getting a psychologically rich moment here. And I'm learning more about my friends. And then because I'm doing the same thing, they see things through my perspective, what I would think about pancakes for breakfast, no, and being on the third floor, yay. And yeah, so I just had this little insight there, how like the perspective is connected in there as well. I have one question about this because yes, we can talk about these things with friends and really talk about what we think, really talk about what we feel. When in an acquaintance, getting to know someone, would you start throwing that in? Because I've made the experience that if in the United States I am being asked by the checkout clerk how my day is going, and I tell them, that's not what they expect. This is like, great, how are you? Let's move on. Where's that getting introduced?
I think that's individual and depending on one's comfort level. I very often respond to the checkout counter in an honest way. And my experience is that some will just freeze and not know what to say back. And then the moment's over and it doesn't really bother me. But it can bother some individuals, particularly if you are working on this. And so be honest wherever you want to. And you might have to push yourself a little bit, but you'll feel those things, right? Where somebody will just ask you, how was your day? Rather than going into that automatic mode of rattling off what you did, right? Talk about the struggles you had to get your kid to school on time. Talk about the struggles you had at work. Talk about whether you're bored at work. So there's different layers, and depending on where you're starting, you'll need to work to get it in sooner rather than later. But as soon as it feels right to you, and notice that that's going to involve pushing yourself a little bit, right? So I don't mean as soon as it feels easy, but as soon as it feels okay for you to do.
It's not going to feel easy at the beginning. Oh yeah, like don't wait for that. That's going to go horribly wrong. Yeah. Okay, that's a plan. Let's do that from here on out. Someone asks, "How are you doing?" Tell them.
Be honest.
So my final question for you as we're coming to the end of our time together here. When I think about you teaching this, researching this, but primarily teaching it to others, experimenting with it yourself, seeing how it's perceived and understood by others, what's the biggest misconception that people have around a psychologically rich life that we might want to say, hey, look out for this. This is probably something that's going to happen to you as you try this out and learn this?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest misconceptions may be that a psychologically rich life is all about sensations, adventures, travel experiences. And we often find these quotes about like, well, just go for the experience, gather the experience. And it's certainly all of these things border on psychological richness, but they set the bar wrong in two ways. First of all, they set the bar too high. We can experience psychological richness on the day-to-day without changing our lives. Yeah. And I think that is so important. It means we can fill in all of the gaps in our day-to-day by making them more interesting. And that enhances our life dramatically, very easily. And the second thing that's wrong about just thinking about, oh, it's just about experiences or pushing myself to engage in these things is we can easily get into these kind of risk-taking traps or sensation-seeking traps where we're going for something that's going to stimulate, but in the wrong way. So what we're looking for when we're going after psychological richness is stimulating our minds and engaging our thoughts and emotions. But very often we think that, well, I've got to fly out of a plane to do it. And that's wrong. And so I think there is the tendency to blur those lines a bit. And so I talk a lot in the book about how you've got to pay attention to what you're after, really understand what the interesting is, how it is a feature of cognitive engagement, and then keep your eye on what you're looking for, right? So you don't want to fall into a trap of thinking you have to do something big, and you don't want to fall in the trap of seeking, risky adventures. And there's fine lines between these things, but you want to learn the lines. And the way to do that, I believe, is to really understand what psychological richness is, understanding what interesting experiences are, so that you can really keep your eye on the prize and stay within the confines, not going over to too much risk-taking. So I think that's kind of the misconception, that that's a risky way of living or something like that and requires big changes. So those are two things that I think we need to know right away.
Yeah.
Neither of those is true.
Beautiful. Well, Lorraine, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for writing such a fantastic book. And it was a pleasure talking with you.
Yes, thank you. It was really nice talking with you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.